Hello, I'm Karen Stathoplos, and today I'm going to be reading the first two chapters of a book I love, Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, that I first read. I had to read it when I was a freshman in high school. I guess that might have been a normal thing, but I've read it since, and it's really quite rambunctiously exciting. And here on this little tiny weird book from long ago, it gives a short description. Dickens' wonderful mystery story set in Victorian England is full of excitement, humor, heartbreak, and people so full of life that they can never be forgotten. And I completely agree with that. So, here we go. My father's family name being Pierup and my Christian name Philip, my infant tongue could make of both names nothing longer or more explicit than Pip. So I called myself Pip and came to be called Pip. I give Pierup as my father's family name on the authority of his tombstone and my sister, Mrs. Joe Gargery, who married the blacksmith. As I never saw my father or my mother, my first fancies regarding what they were like were unreasonably derived from their tombstones. Ours was the marsh country down by the river, within as the river wound 20 miles of the sea. My first, most vivid and broad impression of the identity of things seems to me to have been gained on a memorable raw afternoon towards evening. At such a time, I found out for certain that this bleak place overgrown with nettles was the churchyard, and that the small bundle of shivers growing afraid of it all and beginning to cry was Pip. "Hold your noise!" cried a terrible voice as a man started up from among the graves at the side of the church porch. "Keep still, you little devil, or I'll cut your throat." A fearful man, all in coarse gray, with a great iron on his leg, a man with no hat, with broken shoes, and an old rag tied around his head, a man who had been soaked in water, smothered in mud, lamed by stones, cut by flints, and stung by nettles, and torn by briars, who limped and shivered and glared and growled, and whose teeth chattered in his head as he seized me by the chin. "Ow! Don't cut my throat, sir," I pleaded in terror. "Oh, pray don't do it, sir." "Tell us your name," said the man. "Quick!" "Pip, sir." "Once more," said the man, staring at me. "Give it mouth." "Pip, Pip, Pip, sir." "Show us where you live," said the man. "Point out the place." I pointed to where our village lay on the flat inshore among the alder trees, a mile or more from the church. The man, after looking at me for a moment, turned me upside down and emptied my pockets. There was nothing in them but a piece of bread, and when I came right again, I found myself seated on a high tombstone, trembling while he ate the bread ravenously. "You young dog," said the man, licking his lips. "What fat cheeks you got." "Darn me if I couldn't eat 'em," said the man, with a threatening shake of his head, "and if I ain't half a mind to it." I earnestly expressed my hope that he wouldn't, and held tighter to the tombstone on which he had put me, partly to keep myself upon it, and partly to keep from crying. "Now, looky here," said the man, "where's your mother?" "There, sir," said I. He started, made a short run, and stopped and looked over his shoulder. "There, sir," I timidly explained. "That's my mother." "Ow," he said, coming back. "And is that your father alonger your mother?" "Yes, sir, him too." "Ha!" he muttered then, considering. "Who do you live with, supposin' you're kindly let to live, which I ain't made up my mind about?" "But my sister, sir, Mrs. Joe Gargery, wife of Joe Gargery, the blacksmith, sir." "Blacksmith, eh?" said he, and he looked down at his leg. After darkly looking at his leg and me several times, he came closer to my tombstone, took me by both arms, and tilted me as far back as he could hold me, so that his eyes looked most powerfully down into mine, and mine looked most helplessly up into his. "Now, looky here," he said. "The question being whether you're to be let to live. You know what a file is? Yes, sir. And you know what whittles is? Yes, sir. After each question, he tilted me over a little more. You get me a file, and you get me whittles. You bring 'em both to me, or I'll have your rotten liver out. He tilted me again. I was dreadfully frightened and so giddy that I clung to him with both hands and said, if you would kindly please to keep me upright, sir, perhaps I shouldn't be sick and I could attend more. He gave me a most tremendous dip and roll. And then he held me by the arms in an upright position on top of the stone and went on in these fearful terms. You bring me tomorrow morning early that file and them whittles. You bring the lot to me at that old battery over yonder. You do it, and you never dare to say a word or dare to make a sign concerning your having seen such a person as me, or any person somever, and you shall be let to live. You fail, or you go for my words in any particular, no matter how small it might be, and your heart and your liver shall be tore out, roasted, and ate. Now, I ain't alone as you might think I am. There's a young man with me, along of which, considering that young man, I am an angel. That young man is the words I speak. That young man has a secret way peculiar to himself of getting at a boy, and at his heart and at his liver. It is in vain for a boy to attempt to hide himself from that young man. A boy may lock his door, may be warm in bed, may tuck himself up, draw the clothes over his head, may think himself comfortable and safe, but that young man will softly creep his way to him and tear him open. I'm a-keeping that young man from harming you at the present moment with great difficulty. I find it very hard to hold that young man off of your inside. Now, what do you say? I said that I would get him the file and I would get him what broken bits of food I could, and I would come to him at the battery early in the morning. Say, Lord strike you dead if you don't, said the man. I said so, and he took me down. Now, he pursued, you remember what you've undertook, and you remember that young man, and you get home. At the same time, he hugged himself, his shuddering body in both his arms clasping himself as if to hold himself together, and limped off toward the low church wall. I saw him go. When he came to the low church wall, he got over it like a man whose legs were numbed and stiff, and then turned around to look for me. When I saw him turning, I set my face towards home and made the best use of my legs. On the edge of the river, I could faintly make out only the two black things in all the prospect that seemed to be standing upright. One of these was the beacon by which the sailors steered. The other, a gibbet with some chains hanging to it, which had once held a pirate. Oh, the man was limping on towards this ladder as if he were the pirate come to life. It gave me a terrible turn when I thought so. So I looked all around for the horrible young man, and I could see no signs of him. But now I was frightened again and ran home without stopping. Chapter 2. My sister, Mrs. Jo Gargery, was more than 20 years older than I and had established a great reputation with herself and the neighbors because she had brought me up by hand. Having at that time to find out for myself what the expression meant, and knowing her to have a hard and heavy hand, which she was much in the habit of laying upon her husband as well as upon me, I supposed that Jo Gargery and I were both brought up by hand. She was not a good-looking woman, my sister, and I had a general impression that she must have made Jo Gargery marry her by hand. She was tall and bony with black hair and eyes. Jo's forge adjoined our house, which was a wooden house. When I ran home from the churchyard, the forge was shut up, and Jo was sitting alone in the kitchen. Joe and I, being fellow sufferers and having confidences as such, Joe imparted a confidence to me the moment I raised the latch of the door. Mrs. Joe has been out a dozen times looking for you, Pip, and she's out now making a baker's dozen. Is she? Yes, Pip, said Joe. And what's worse, she's got Tickler with her. At this dismal intelligence, I twisted the only button on my waistcoat around and looked in great depression at the fire. Tickler was a wax-ended piece of cane, worn smooth by collision with my tickled frame. She sat down, said Joe, and she got up, and she rampaged out. That's what she did, said Joe. She rampaged out, Pip. Has she been gone long, Joe? I always treated him as a larger species of child and no more than my equal. Well, said Joe, glancing at the clock, she's been on the rampage this last spell about 5 minutes, Pip. She's a-comin'. Get behind the door, old chap, and have the jack towel betwixt you. I took the advice. My sister, Mrs. Joe, throwing the door wide open and finding an obstruction behind it, immediately divined the cause and applied Tickler to its further investigation. Where have you been, you young monkey? Said Mrs. Joe, stamping her foot. Tell me directly what you've been doing to wear me away with fret and fright and worry, or I'll have you out of that corner. I have only been to the churchyard, said I, from my stool, crying and rubbing myself. Churchyard, repeated my sister. If it weren't for me, you'd have been to the churchyard long ago and stayed there. Who brought you up by hand? You did, said I. And why did I do it, I should like to know, exclaimed my sister. I whimpered, I don't know. I don't, said my sister. I'd never do it again, I know that. Ha, said Mrs. Joe, restoring Tickler to his station. Churchyard, indeed. You may well say churchyard. And she applied herself to set the tea things. My sister had a trenchant way of cutting our bread and butter for us that never varied. First, with her left hand, she jammed the loaf hard against her chest, fast against her bib, where it sometimes got a pin into it and sometimes a needle, which afterwards we got into our mouths. Then she took some butter, not too much, on a knife, spread it on the loaf in an apothecary kind of way, as if she were making a plaister, using both sides of the knife with a slapping dexterity, trimming and molding the butter off round the crust. Then she gave the knife a final smart wipe on the edge of the plaister, sawed a very thick round off, hewed it into 2 halves, of which Joe got one and I got the other. On the present occasion, though I was hungry, I dared not eat my slice. I felt that I must have something in reserve for my dreadful acquaintance and his ally, the still more dreadful young man. I knew Mrs. Joe's housekeeping to be of the strictest kind, and that my larcenous researches might find nothing available in the pantry. The effort of resolution necessary to the achievement of this purpose I found to be quite awful. I desperately considered that the thing I contemplated must be done, and that it had best be done in the least improbable manner consistent with the circumstances. I took advantage of a moment when Joe had just looked at me and got my bread and butter down my leg. Joe was evidently made uncomfortable by what he supposed my loss of appetite. He was about to take another bite and had just got his head on one side for a good purchase on it when his eye fell on me and saw that my bread and butter was gone. The wonder and consternation with which Joe stopped on the threshold of his bite and stared at me were too evident to escape my sister's observation. "What's the matter now?" she said smartly as she put down her cup. I say, muttered Joe, Pip, old chap, you'll do yourself a mischief. It'll stick somewhere. You and me is always friends, Pip, and I'd be the last to tell upon you. But such a most uncommon bolt as that. Been bolting his food, has he? Cried my sister. Old chap, said Joe, looking at me and not at Mrs. Joe, I bolted myself when I was your age, and I've been among many a bolter, but I never see the like to equal your bolting. My sister made a dive at me and fished me up by the hair, saying nothing more than the awful words, "You come along and be doused." Some medical beast had revived tar water in those days as a fine medicine, and Mrs. Joe always kept a supply of it. It was administered to me and poured down my throat. Conscience is a dreadful thing when it accuses man or boy, but when, in the case of a boy, that secret burden cooperates with another secret burden down the leg of his trousers, it is a great punishment. The guilty knowledge that I was going to rob Mrs. Joe, I never thought I was going to rob Joe, for I never thought of any of the housekeeping property as his, united to the necessity of always keeping one hand on my bread and butter as I sat or was ordered about the kitchen on any small errand, almost drove me out of my mind. I felt and I thought, what if the young man who was with so much difficulty restrained from imbruing his hands in me should yield to a constitutional impatience, or should mistake the time and should think himself accredited to my heart and liver tonight instead of tomorrow? If anybody's hair ever stood on end, it was mine. It was Christmas Eve, and I had to stir the pudding for next day with a copper stick from 7 to 8. "Hark!" said I, when I had done my stirring and was taking a final warm in the chimney corner before being sent up to bed. "Was that great guns, Joe?" "Ah," said Joe, "it's another convict off." "What does that mean, Joe?" said I. Mrs. Joe, who always took explanations upon herself, said snappishly, "Escaped, escaped," administering the definition like tar water. While Mrs. Joe sat with her head bending over her needlework, I put my mouth into the form of saying, "What's a convict?" "There was a convict off last night," said Joe aloud, "after sunset gun, and they fired warning of him, and now it appears they're firing warning of another." "Who's firing?" said I. "Drat that boy," interposed my sister, frowning at me over her work. "What a questioner he is! Ask no questions and you'll be told no lies." It was not very polite to herself, I thought, to imply that I should be told lies by her, even if I did ask questions. "Mrs. Joe," said I, as a last resort, "I should like to know, if you wouldn't much mind, where the firing comes from?" "Lord bless the boy!" exclaimed my sister, as if she didn't quite mean that, but the contrary. "From the Oaks." "Oh," said I, looking at Joe. "Oaks? And please, what's Oaks?" said I. "That's the way with this boy," exclaimed my sister, pointing me out with her needle and thread and shaking her head at me. "Answer him one question and he'll ask you a dozen directly. Oaks are prison ships right across the marshes." "I wonder who's put into prison ships and why they're put there," said I, in a general way with quiet desperation. It was too much for Mrs. Joe, who immediately rose. "I tell you what, young fellow," she said, "I didn't bring you up by hand to badger people's lives out. It would be blind to me and not praise if I had. People are put in the Oaks because they murder, because they rob and forge and do all sorts of bad, and they always begin by asking questions. Now you get along to bed." I was never allowed a candle to light me to bed, and as I went upstairs in the dark with my head tingling from Mrs. Joe's thimble having played the tambourine upon it, I fearfully felt sensible of the great convenience that the hulks were handy for me. I was clearly on my way there. I had begun by asking questions, and I was going to rob Mrs. Joe. I was in mortal terror of the young man who wanted my heart and liver. I was in mortal terror of my interlocutor with the iron leg. I was in mortal terror of myself. I had no hope of deliverance through my all-powerful sister who repulsed me at every turn. If I slept at all that night, it was only to imagine myself drifting down the river on a strong spring tide to the hulks, a ghostly pirate calling out to me as I passed the gibbet that I had better come ashore and be hanged at once and not put it off. I was afraid to sleep, even if I had been inclined, for I knew that the first faint light of dawn I must rob the pantry. There was no doing it in the night. So as soon as the great black velvet pall outside my little window was shot with gray, I got up and went downstairs, every board upon the way and every crack in every board calling after me, "Stop, thief! Get up, Mrs. Joe!" In the pantry, which was far more abundantly supplied than usual, owing to the season, I felt very much alarmed by a hare hanging up by the heels, who I rather thought was winking at me. I had no time for verification, no time for selection, no time for anything, for I had no time to spare. I stole some bread, some rind of cheese, half a jar of mincemeat, some brandy from a stone bottle, and a beautiful, round, compact pork pie. I was nearly going away without the pie, but I was tempted to mount upon a shelf to look what it was that was put away so carefully. I took it in the hope it was not intended for early use and would not be missed for some time. There was a door in the kitchen communicating with the forge. I unlocked it, got the file from among Joe's tools, put the fastenings back as I found them, opened the door at which I had entered when I ran home last night, shut it, and ran for the marshes.